There we go. Do you have any questions from what you've done so far? Unit 1, I think you're part of the way through Unit 2 now, are you?
Yeah, it's just because I'm going to Toronto, like July 1st.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just trying to get like a majority of it done so that,
So you can enjoy a little vacation?
Yep, but I'm still gonna be there for the Skype meeting, so
Oh, okay. That's great. Yeah, no, I think July 3rd should be fine. It's just the scheduling conflict I had June 26th, so I think I will skip doing Skype and I'll just do a pre-recording for that session.
okay.
Any questions about anything so far?
Nope, the unit's actually been really fun to read, in my opinion.
Oh, that's good. Unit 1 or you're enjoying Unit 2?
Both, to be honest.
Both. That's cool. I really like getting into the system, so getting into digestion and respiration. I like getting into those things, so.
Yep.
All right, so I'll just do a little review of chapter 21. If you want to go ahead and mute your mic, you can, and then if you want to pop in and ask anything, then please do.
Okay.
And you can also use the chat box over to the left too if you want. So yeah, just pop in if you need anything. Okay, so chapter 21. Oops, my book's on the wrong section here. All right. So this chapter is kind of getting us started into how animals are structured and that principle of anatomy and physiology, what those two definitions mean. So a first question to think of, and it's something to be aware of going into tests. So what exactly is anatomy and physiology, and what is this commonly used term that's mentioned here? So, oh, hi, we have one more person joined us there. That's okay. Yeah, it's all right. Don't worry about it. We're recording anyway. Um, so so anatomy, so you can think of that as, does anyone know the answer to this one? You can put a letter over onto the side there if you want. So anatomy is the study of organism's something, while physiology is the study of blank. And a commonly used term in biology is form fits blank. So do you happen to know which answer would be the correct one? And I'm good. Thank you for asking. So the correct answer for this one would be C. So anatomy is the study of an organism's structure. So anatomy is like the physical parts that make up something. Well, physiology is the study of function. So physiology is how those parts work. So how does it work? And then a commonly used term in biology is form fits function. So how something is structured. For example, teeth and how they physically look and how it fits function. So for what they have to do. So teeth in the front are kind of sharp and flat, good for biting and tearing things off, whereas our teeth in the back are more flat and sturdy, which is good for chewing and grinding things up. So that's what's meant by form fits function. So this diagram in your book is a good example of how this all fits together. So we start off as the smallest functional unit in our body, which is the cell. So in this example, it gives a muscle cell, but that could also be a nerve cell or a skin cell or a skeletal muscle cell, but it's the basic functional unit of anatomy, the cell. So when all of those cells come together, they can create different kinds of tissues, which we'll get into. So tissues is number 2. So in this example, all of those muscle cells come together to make a tissue, which is muscle tissue. When several different kinds of tissues come together, it creates an organ. So in this example, this muscle cell was actually some cardiac muscle, which made some cardiac tissue, which actually comes together with other kinds of tissues to make an organ. In this example, a heart. When more than one organ comes together, it creates an organ system. Oh, that's down here, I guess, organ system. So in this example, it's the circulatory system. So this system includes the heart and also these blood vessels, arteries, veins. So all of those come together to make the circulatory system. So then when all of our systems come together, so for example, our circulatory system, our digestive system, our nervous system, all of those things we're going to learn about in this course, when all of them come together, we create one organism. So a complete organism, which is this human here. So getting into tissues, so remember the cells are the basic functional unit of our bodies, and those cells come together to make different tissues. So there are four main categories of tissues. Now, if there were more of you, I may ask, if you want to go ahead and type answers over there, what are the four different types of tissues? Or right here on the slide, up in the top corner, you can see a little pen. You can even write on my slides if you want. That's right. Epithelial is the first type of tissue. That's good. Epithelial, and then the C is connective. That's right. M is for muscle tissue, and N is for nervous tissue. So that's right. So the first type you mentioned there is epithelial tissue. So this one is a tissue that will cover the surface of the body and line most of your organs. So it primarily has a protective role, really. So without our skin, we would be very exposed, or without the epithelial lining of our stomach, we wouldn't be able to digest things properly. So it really has a lot of protective function to it. And this diagram gives examples of organs that are lined with epithelial tissue, like your heart, lung, stomach, like I said, small intestine, your bladder. This one also shows the lining of your esophagus. And then like your skin is an example of it too. The next kind of tissue that you mentioned was connective tissue. So connective tissue, so this is kind of giving you what the definition of connective tissue is. So connective tissue has a sparse population of blank spread out throughout a jelly-like material called the blank matrix. It's D, that's right. So it's made up of cells. So again, those cells come together to make tissues, and the part of what makes connective tissue different is that the cells are actually scattered throughout this matrix. And depending on which type of connective tissue it is, that matrix will look different. So two of the major functions of connective tissue are to support and join other tissues. So that's kind of the main function happening. So unfortunately for your studying, there are actually 6 different types of this one tissue. So some of them, not everyone realizes that something like blood and bone are actually considered tissues, but all of these are types of connective tissues. So the first one, loose connective tissue. So it's the one that binds epithelial to other kinds of tissues. So for example, on this diagram it shows the skin being bound to the layer beneath it, and so that's where loose connective tissue comes into play, and that's actually the most common or widespread connective tissue in your whole body as a human. So that's the loose connective tissue. Adipose tissue being the next kind. So this tissue is what stores fat in cells in amongst a matrix again. So fat has a function of being stored energy when we need it, and it also provides an insulation to help keep us warm, and also a cushion. So an example is the fatty adipose tissue on the heel of your foot actually provides a cushion to protect the bone underneath as you walk. So adipose tissue. Okay, the next one is blood. So blood is a little different from the rest in that the matrix that it's suspended in is actually liquid. So it's plasma. So all of your blood cells are suspended in plasma. And the main function is just of blood is transporting different substances around to different parts of your body. So we'll get into that a little bit more in the circulatory unit, but blood is a connective tissue, so that's what's important to remember in this unit. Fibrous connective tissue. So this guy here, so it has a bit more structure to it than something like blood, so it's more dense. So when something is harder, you would say the matrix that contains the cells is more dense. It's made up of collagen, so this is what forms tendons that attach muscle to bones, and also ligaments, which joins two bones together. So I'm really terrible at writing with this, but fibrous connective tissue could be tendons, and it could also be ligaments. See, I told you I was terrible at writing this thing. Cartilage. So cartilage is the fifth type of connective tissue, and so cartilage, it's a very strong connective tissue. So one, you can actually feel what it might feel like by wiggling your ear. So your ear is made up of cartilage. Also, some of the structure in the tip of your nose is cartilage. Cartilage also acts as what might cushion or connect two bones together. So for example, you'd have some between the bones in your knee. So you'll often hear of people talking about having a damaged cartilage, like if they play sports or something. And cartilage heals very slowly actually because it doesn't have a great blood supply, so it doesn't get a lot of oxygen and nutrients to it. And the last kind of connective tissue is bone. So bone is very rigid, which helps keep the structure to our body, and it has an extremely dense matrix that also has a lot of deposits of calcium in it. And feel free to stop me if you want me to explain something differently or have questions about things. All right, so muscle tissue is the next type of tissue in your body. So there are three kinds of muscle tissue. So one of them is voluntary, and two of them are involuntary. Let me see here. So this skeletal muscle over here is voluntary. So that's one of the main differences between these different types. And then these two over here are involuntary. So that means at will you can say, all right, skeletal muscle in my arm, I want you to contract and pick my arm up. You can think about moving those things, whereas some muscle tissue that is involuntary means you don't have to think about it. You don't have to think there and think, okay, heart, you need to beat, beat, beat. I think we'd die pretty quickly if we had to remember to do that. And also smooth muscle, which is you know, part of what like pushes food through our digestive tract. So you also don't have to think about that one. So the main difference between skeletal muscle and the other type is that skeletal muscle is voluntary. So if you're looking at cardiac muscle and smooth muscle, so cardiac muscle you are only going to find in the heart. So it has, short, effective contractions that allow a coordinated heartbeat. So you're only going to find cardiac muscle tissue in the heart. Smooth muscle tissue, so like I said, you can find it all along your digestive tract to move food along. You could also find it in the uterus, so contractions for childbirth, that's what happens. So smooth muscle, it's able to contract slowly and for a long period of time. So that's the how one way you could describe it compared to the other ones is that it's slow, can contract slowly and over a long period of time. All right. And the fourth type of tissue is nervous tissue. So if you go to take cookies out of the oven and touch a hot pan without wearing a glove or without wearing an oven mitt, you immediately will pull your hand back. So that is thanks to your nervous tissue. So it actually makes communication between muscles and your whole body communicates with your brain to tell you to do different things. So nervous tissue is all about that communication that happens. And this is an example. So this is a picture of a nerve cell right here, which is the basis of nervous tissue. So a nerve cell is actually called a neuron. So then there's a couple pages in your textbook, like 462, 463, that just talks about when, those tissues come together to make organs, and organs make organ systems. That's what we're going to be talking about in really the rest of the course. So we're going to talk about, our digestive system, our urinary system, circulatory, respiratory, immune systems. So then on page 464, we get into regulating the internal environment. So this just says like one of the characteristics that distinguish a living organism from a non-living organism is our ability to respond to environmental stimulus. So a rock, for example, is non-living and it doesn't care if it's 30 degrees outside or negative 20 outside. It doesn't have to eat or react in the environment in any way to just exist. Whereas a living organism has to do all those things. It has to care, whether it's 30 degrees or minus 30 degrees outside. This figure is just an extremely basic example of a living organism, and it shows how every organism is an open system. So even if this were a picture of a single cell, an open system means that we're always exchanging things with our environment. So exchanging chemicals, exchanging energy. So that's air, food. We're also, wastes are being excreted as well. So feces and urine. We are constantly involved with our external environment. And one thing to keep in mind is that every cell in an animal's body does have to be surrounded by like water in some way or some kind of watery solution. So that's easy for a single cell organism that lives in a pond. All of its whole body is exposed to cells. For something like humans, our cells are always bathed in fluid by having plasma membranes that exchange things for us. Like that's how things get dissolved and brought to our bodies through being exposed to that watery environment. So homeostasis. So this is a word you're going to hear a lot in this course. Homeostasis is on page 465 where it talks about it as a definition. So which of these answers do you think is correct? Is homeostasis the body's ability to stay relatively unchanged even when the world around it changes? Or B, maintain a constant internal state, or prevent negative feedback? So Christina, you are right, it is A. So our internal environment always changes a little bit. For example, our temperature, our body likes to be around 37 degrees, but we're always going to fluctuate a bit. We could be 36.2, we could be 37.5. So it always fluctuates a little bit, but it stays relatively constant, even though everything around us changes. So ways that we keep this steady state internally, one way is called negative feedback. So negative feedback is essentially, so your book describes it as a form of regulation in which the results of a process inhibit that same process. So another way to say that is, so your body is detecting a change, and then because of that change, a process is started that will give the opposite effect. So in your book, it talks about temperature a lot. So it gives an example like this. So if your room temperature is set at 20 degrees, so 20 degrees is where it likes to be, or whoever lives there, it likes to be 20 degrees. But for whatever reason, that room temperature is actually getting above that. So maybe it's 35 degrees outside, so your room temperature is getting higher. Say it's 21 or 22 degrees. So once the thermostat detects that, it's going to turn the heater off. So the heater stops, it turns off. Your room temperature will decrease some, hopefully back to that set point of 20 degrees. So that's an example of negative feedback. So the very process that started it will actually stop it when it gets above that. So a change is detected that's above homeostasis. And then so the opposite effects happens by stopping the heat to bring the room temperature back down. Less common is positive feedback. So definitely homeostasis happens or is kept with negative feedback most often, but there are a few examples in our body of positive feedback. So that means the results of a process actually produce more of that same process. So an example of that is childbirth. When contractions start, the process of having contractions and the hormones involved actually cause labor to become more and more and more intense. And another example is lactation. So with a baby that's breastfeeding, the more the infant removes milk or breastfeeds from the mother, the more milk the mother will make. So that's a positive feedback. The more they do it, the more it happens. So the big example of negative feedback for this unit is thermoregulation. So endotherms like mammals and birds, they have we have a fairly constant internal body temperature, and most of that heat actually comes from metabolism, which is breaking down of our food. So there are a few examples of ways our body can stay warm or stay cool. And here's how that negative feedback loop might look like for a human. So our body temperature is near 30 to 37 degrees Celsius, so that's kind of where we like to be. So there's a stimulus happening, so our body temperature gets above that set point. Say we're sitting outside on a very hot day maybe. A part of our brain detects that our body temperature is getting a little too warm, so we have a response to that. So for humans, We sweat, so by sweating, that moisture evaporates and takes heat with it. And also our blood vessels dilate. So if you ever got exercised on a really warm day and your face gets really red, that's one way of your body cooling itself. The more blood that is brought to the surface of your skin, that the more heat will come off. So it's one way of getting rid of heat by dilating those blood vessels. Dilating means to get wider. So letting more blood near the surface of the skin where heat can escape. So after we sweat and our blood vessels dilate, our face gets really red, then hopefully our body temperature will come back down to where it needs to be, and then we're back at 37 degrees Celsius. So then the loop also works the other way. We can start to get too cold, like we're sitting out waiting for the bus when it's 20 below in a snowstorm. Our brain detects that our body is getting too cold, so we have responses to that. So our blood vessels constrict, so less blood is getting to the surface of our skin so that we're holding blood closer into our internal organs to keep them warm. We start to shiver, so shivering actually moves our muscles to create heat, and our metabolic rate increases, so we are burning more energy so that our body's giving off more heat by breaking down, metabolizing energy or food. And then our body temperature will rise again to get back to that 37 degrees Celsius. So this is an example of homeostasis. And we'll have other examples of that as we go through as well. Is there any questions about that so far? So that comes to the end of review for chapter 21. I have maybe a review question here that you could answer. So organ systems are required by, so these are organ systems. Are they required by, so think of what an animal is when you're thinking about this. So is this organ system, so that an example of that would be all the organs coming together to make your digestive tract. So like your stomach, your esophagus, your small intestine, your large intestine, that's an organ system. So are they required by all animals? Unicellular animals, meaning like a single cell animal. Animals with complex body forms, or animals that have cells bathed in fluid. Which one of those do you think would require organ systems? So you can click right on the screen. Good, so the answer is actually animals with complex body forms. That's right. So it wouldn't be all animals, because some animals are only like 1 or 2 cells. So they have very simple structures which would not have organ systems. And organ systems, yeah, so it's animals with complex body forms, so like humans and birds and reptiles, amphibians. We're complex, so we require those systems. Okay, good. Here's another question. So blood is a type of extracellular matrix, connective tissue, adipose tissue, or epithelial tissue. That's right, you both got it right. So it's connective tissue. So connective tissue has those 6 types that you'll have to take a peek at as we go through. All right, so since we're only a half hour in, I think I may start some of chapter 22. So I just need to bring up that PowerPoint file. Okay, so this one is on the digest. So these PowerPoints I have here include digestion and respiratory systems. We'll start into the digestive system and we'll see how far we get. Otherwise, like I said, I'm going to skip doing the Skype session just next Tuesday, and I'll just post like a pre-recorded review of the rest of what we don't get to today for Unit 2. So what's your favorite food? So go ahead and write it in. You can do it right on the slide, or you can do it in the chat over there. What's my favorite food? I think I like cheesecake. I think that's probably my favorite. But oh, I do like noodles too, though. Oh, burgers. I like burgers as well. Now I'm hungry. Oh, I included here just some feedback from Unit 1 to just make sure the sources you are using in assignments are credible. Like you wouldn't want to use it from a site like a joke site or whatever. Make sure things are based on research, and be sure that you're referencing things in APA format. So the library has a great guide. There's a link there that you could use from our college library that has videos and written things on APA. I've also included it in our reference section in our D2L. So that includes good referencing, not plagiarizing, and using in-text citations. So when you're writing something, make sure it's pointing you directly to which reference that statement came from. Study guides are also on our D2L site. And this just explains chapter objectives. So what are some of the major things that we're going to point out as we go through this chapter 22 on nutrition and digestion. So the digestive system. Okay, so why do we even have to digest food? So it's necessary for a couple of reasons. So if you eat a carrot, if you put a carrot inside your body, the pieces are much too big to pass over our cell membranes, so it literally can't make it to where it needs to fuel our bodies. Also, molecules that make up a carrot in their current form are very different from the cells and molecules that make up our body. So in order for our body to get nutrition it needs to, say, make new skin cells, it actually has to break all food down into molecules that can actually be used by our body to make new cells. So without digestion, we would not be able to absorb any of those nutrients, which is really the main function of our digestive system, changing food into things we could absorb. So here is a matching question. So these 4 things are the 4 stages of food processing. So ingestion, digestion, absorption, and elimination. So let me just get a pen here. So ingestion is literally just taking food into your mouth or eating. So ingestion means you are taking a bite of noodles or taking a bite of your burger. So ingestion is taking that food into your mouth and eating it. Digestion means you are you're close there. Whoops, I tried to make a D there, and yeah, you're good. I tried to make a D there, and the thing didn't connect right away. Okay, so digestion is that's the breakdown of food into smaller particles. So that's the actual breakdown of that burger, carrot, or noodles into smaller pieces. Absorption is uptake of small nutrients by your cell. So those nutrients are actually crossing the cell membranes to get where they need to go. And then elimination is disposal of undigested material left over from food. So that would be, in the case of the digestive system, feces. So disposing of what your body can't use. So here's a question. Where does digestion, both mechanical and chemical, begin? So here's two terms that have to do with digestion. So mechanical means that food is physically being made smaller. So chewing it up is making it smaller. The stomach muscles churning and mixing is also kind of physically making it smaller. And then chemical digestion is a bit different, where there are chemical reactions actually happening that break down large molecules by adding water molecules to break them down chemically. So you're right, A. So both mechanical and chemical digestion begins in the mouth. And mechanical is the chewing, of course, by our teeth, and chemical digestion also starts in the mouth with our saliva. So saliva is actually starting the process of breaking down carbohydrates, specifically starches. So it starts right there in your mouth. This diagram in your textbook, it's a good one. So I've removed all of the answers there, but it's a good one to study, and the reason is a question that could come up in a test, for example, could be, what if you take a bite of the apple, like this lady in the picture, what is it the apple meeting first? So that would be the mouth. Then what is the apple meeting? So as it's chewed up, your tongue forms it into a food bolus, and you're able to swallow it. So that's what this next one's talking about, is your tongue. The next place it meets is this pharynx. So that is kind of the crossroads between your trachea. So this is your trachea that would go down to your lungs. And this is your esophagus, which goes down into your stomach. So the pharynx is kind of the back of the throat, and it's almost a crossroads between those two pipes. So after you swallow that piece of apple past your pharynx, it's now into your esophagus. After it leaves your esophagus, it enters your stomach. After it leaves your stomach, it goes into this first part of your intestine, which is important. We'll talk about that in a minute. But it's into your small intestine now. After it leaves your small intestine, it enters into your large intestine, or your colon. This little arrow right here is actually pointing at your appendix. Oh no, I have to write with this again. So food technically shouldn't be going in there, but after it leaves your small intestine, it goes into your large intestine, or your colon. After it's done in your colon, it goes into your rectum, and then leaves via your anus. So it leaves as feces down here. So be aware of the order in which food meets that alimentary canal as it goes. So over on this other side are some of your accessory organs, like this first one's talking about your salivary glands. This one, salivary glands, so that's making your saliva. This one's your liver, which makes bile. This is your gallbladder, which stores bile. And this one is talking about your pancreas in here, which also kind of neutralizes stomach acid and has a few more digestive enzymes. So those are the accessory structures. So breathing and swallowing. So here's an important piece. So after you swallow a piece of apple, for example, when it meets this pharynx right here, this crossroads that I talked about, why doesn't apple just keep on traveling right down your windpipe into your lungs. Well, sometimes those things do happen, and it's causes you to cough and cough and cough, or it can even block your airway completely and you can choke. But ideally that never happens, and that's thanks to this guy called the epiglottis. So the epiglottis is this little kind of flap of skin that's located in and around the pharynx, this crossroads. So when we're breathing, it remains open. So we breathe, air passes through, goes down into your trachea to your lungs, how it's supposed to. But when we swallow, the process of swallowing, and if you put your hand on your throat and swallow, you can feel that it moves up a little bit. Your throat moves a little bit as you swallow, and that process is actually causing your epiglottis here to close over top of your trachea, so that when you swallow, food is going past it into your esophagus. So sometimes that messes up a little bit and you cough and hack because food's going down the wrong hole, right? But ideally the epiglottis protects it and you can swallow without choking. So once it gets down the esophagus, it's reaching the stomach. So this is in the esophagus is where you're first meeting some of that smooth muscle tissue we talked about in the last unit. So these muscles contract and relax like a wave almost to move food down the esophagus and actually through the rest of your digestive tract. So it's those slow, controlled, long contractions that move it along. There's a nice picture that gives an example of how that, it's called peristalsis, works on page 480 in your textbook. So once it gets into the stomach, there's some mechanical digestion happening because all of these muscles are contracting and kind of turning the food up. That's why if you eat a big meal or you don't eat and you just have some air in your stomach, you can hear your stomach gurgling and churning. But there's also a lot of chemical digestion happening here too. So this gastric juice is what the food will meet inside your stomach. So it's made up of a strong acid. So it plays an important role in our immune system as well because it can kill bacteria, but it also helps to break up food a bit. There's some digestive enzymes happening here. An important one to remember is pepsin. So this is where protein starts to get broken down. So if you eat some food that's got protein in it, this pepsin is going to meet it here in the stomach and start to break it down into smaller pieces. And you're also going to find mucus in the stomach. So the primary role for mucus is to protect the lining of the stomach. Without it, and sometimes this does happen when people have stomach ulcers, you can develop holes in the stomach of your lining if you don't have this mucus. So this mucus is protective and essentially keeps the stomach from digesting itself, really. So even with that though, even with that mucus coating, cells, the lining, so the epithelial, like we talked about in the first unit, lining of the stomach is still replaced every few days. So it erodes away fairly quickly. So thankfully our body is adjusted to that and can replenish it pretty quickly. So once the food is all mixed in with the gastric juice, it's now called chyme. So C-H-Y-M-E. So now that all of that's mixed together, it's now called chyme. Something neat to keep in mind are these sphincter muscles that happen. You'll see these along many different parts of the digestive tract, and they help keep food, along with the smooth muscle contractions, they help keep food from backflowing to where that's not supposed to go. So once food enters the stomach from the esophagus, technically it should never go back up. So sometimes if you've ever had heartburn or if you have reflux, this is what's happening. This chyme down here gets pushed back up through this sphincter muscle, which is like a ring of muscle that's supposed to stay closed, and up here, and it can cause a burning feeling in your esophagus. It can even damage up there. And again, you see another sphincter muscle down here. So technically, once food goes through here into the small intestine, it shouldn't be able to get back into the stomach. Okay, on to the small intestine. So the small intestine is actually very long. It could be 20 feet or more, depending. It varies a little from person to person, but it's definitely the longest part of your alimentary canal. But it's only about 2.5 centimeters around, so that's why they call it the small intestine. So the small intestine is actually very long, but it's smaller around than the large intestine is. So this is one of the major organs, really. So a lot of chemical digestion happens here, and then this is where you get most of your absorption of nutrients. So the first part of the intestine, the duodenum, or duodenum, depending on who you listen to, it's the name of this first part of the small intestine right here after the stomach. So a lot more chemical digestion happens here. So far I haven't mentioned fats. So this is actually where fats will start to be digested. So like I said, carbohydrates or starches are started to be the digestion for those are starting in the mouth. Pepsin is starting the digestion of proteins in your stomach, and right here in the duodenum is where fats are going to start to be digested, and that's thanks to bile. So bile is your friend when it comes to digesting fats. So it's actually made in the liver and stored in the gallbladder. And then these tubes here connect it into the first part of the small intestine to break down the fats. So if anyone has ever had their gallbladder removed or know somebody that does, you can still live just fine without your gallbladder because your liver is actually making bile. So your liver can still pump out bile. It's just that you wouldn't have a ready supply of it without a gallbladder, so you wouldn't have it collected there in your gallbladder waiting for the fat. So some people with their gallbladder removed, they may have some more issues with digesting fats. Some people don't have those side effects though. And then the pancreas is also connected right here at the duodenum, so it has lots of enzymes that help digest many different nutrients. Okay. And we'll talk about the pancreas again later because it has important functions in the endocrine system as well. So this diagram kind of shows what the inside of your small intestine will look like. So there are all of these villi, these little finger-like projections up into the inner part of the small intestine. And all of these finger-like projections also have finger-like projections here. Does anyone know what these are called? There's only a couple of you here, but they're actually microvilli. So villi have microvilli, and so the whole reason for all of this is having more surface area. So the more surface area we have, that means the more exposure cells have to food. There's more blood flow happening in all of these villi, so more surface area means we can absorb more nutrients. So our small intestine definitely has a lot of surface area because essentially the rest of our small intestine, that's where you're getting almost all of your nutrient absorption. On page 482 in your book, it's actually a cool thing to remember when it talks about the fat digestion is almost happening outside of your body. It gives the example of a donut. If you can put your finger in the hole of a donut, it's still technically outside. It's not really inside the donut if it's in the hole. And so our digestive system is very similar. So you can eat something, you can swallow it, it can be in your stomach, it can be in your small intestine, but it's still technically outside of your body because it's a tube that's open on both ends. That food is still technically outside your body until the third step in the process of food processing, which is absorption. So that's just a cool thing to keep in mind. Okay, as we move into the large intestine, so the large intestine is much shorter than the small intestine. It's only about 5 feet or so in length, but it is much bigger around. Most of the large intestine, it's referred to as the colon, and this, we have some bacteria here that will help us make some vitamins, and it's where feces is created, but one of the absolute main functions of our large intestine is absorbing water. So while our small intestine was absorbing nutrients, our large intestine is making sure we're absorbing water. And then there's the fact of so what is constipation versus diarrhea? So if you are sick or you eat something bad and have food poisoning and you have diarrhea, that's because your body is reacting to that and sending things through your digestive tract quicker in case there's something bad in there, it wants to get rid of it. So if food's passing very quickly through your large intestine, it doesn't get a chance to absorb any water, so it's going to come out very watery. The opposite of that is constipation. So if you're not exercising enough, or if you're not eating enough fiber, or if you have certain bowel conditions that make food move slowly through your large intestine, then your colon is going to absorb too much water from the feces and make really hard stool that's difficult to pass, causing you to be constipated. So this video is included here in case you're interested in it. It's not necessarily a requirement that you have to watch it, but if you're interested in causes of obesity and how bacteria and microbes are so important to our digestive system, then it's a pretty cool video. I think it's about 40 minutes and it's a David Suzuki special. So it's pretty neat if you have time and want to kind of go above and beyond the learning, and it could help you actually in learning this as well. It talks about a lot of the different things we're talking about. I like this figure in your textbook. It's on page 484. It gives a nice, concise view of what we just talked about. So it has the 4 stages of food processing. So ingestion, digestion, absorption, and elimination. And it's color coded, so it shows the purple ingestion is happening here with this purple arrow by putting the food in your mouth. The yellow digestion is happening, so it starts in your mouth up here, so it continues because your food is mixed with saliva down your esophagus. Digestion is still happening in your stomach. Remember, we have that chemical digestion happening with enzymes like pepsin to break down protein. And then chemical digestion is still happening here in the duodenum with bile and your pancreatic enzymes. So this is where fat starts. And then it also breaks it down into mechanical. So what's mechanical digestion? Chewing and churning. What's chemical? That's the saliva, stomach acid. So then number 3 talks about absorption. So you have 2 main types of absorption happening. So small intestine absorbs nutrients and a little bit of water. And the main function of your large intestine is mainly water. And then the green elimination is this green arrow here for feces. So I like that one. It's a nice, concise part of what we just talked about. So that's the basics of the anatomy and physiology of that. The next part of this unit goes into human nutritional requirements. So why do we need food? This diagram is on page 485, and it's a diagram of a cell and how cellular respiration happens, which maybe you remember from the first part of biology. So over here, if you think about food, and then we digest that food down into these molecules that we can use. So an example here was glucose. So this cell is going to use this glucose and this oxygen to make energy. So energy for cell work. ATP, if you remember. So that's not super important for you right now, but it's just talking about how food is used as fuel for our bodies. So what do we need to eat to be healthy? So a big topic when it comes to nutrition is calories. So calories are a measure of the energy stored in your food, as well as energy that you put out during the day. So just by sitting and, just by normal processes your body uses, like digesting your food, breathing, your heart rate, all of that takes a certain amount of energy called your basal metabolic rate. And so your metabolic rate, or your metabolism, some people may call it, so it can vary from person to person depending on size, age, like your stress level, genetics, potentially, but it's basically how fast you burn your food. So some people will burn food quickly and some will burn them more slowly. So beyond that, there's definitely food we need as building materials, and some of them are called essential nutrients. So these are food that our bodies can't make from any other material. So we can't make them from other foods. They have to come directly from foods we eat. So a good diet's going to need to include these essential nutrients. So it talks about essential amino acids. So our cells cannot make these. There are really many different kinds of amino acids. Our body can't make 8 of them. So in your textbook it does give some good examples of some food combinations that you can eat that will give you those 8 essential amino acids, like rice and beans as an example that will give you those 8. Animal protein, so if you eat meat, eggs, and milk, then chances are you're getting those essential amino acids. It's a little trickier if you're a vegetarian because you do need to combine different types of food to get them. Vitamins is the next thing, so it's something we need in very, very small amounts, but they are definitely necessary. For example, if you don't get enough vitamin E in your diet, you could have serious issues with your vision. Minerals, so an example of a mineral that we need in our diet is calcium. So without enough calcium, we could have inadequate bone regeneration or bone growth in young people. Or another example is salt. So we need salt for proper water balance in our bodies, but we don't need too much. So all of these things, there can always be too much of a good thing. I always think about energy drinks that have like 3,000% of our daily recommended intake of B12 and think, that's not always a good thing to have so much of that into one thing. And then essential fatty acids are something else we need in our diet, so they're required to make cell membranes. So malnutrition, so I skipped a little bit of the food label stuff. We'll come back to it a bit, but in your assignment, which I think maybe Christina's already done, is about food labels, so we'll come back to that a bit. So the most common nutritional deficiency, like globally, is, do any of you know, of carbohydrate, protein, iron, or calcium? So malnutrition is like an improper or insufficient diet. So around here, it's not as common. In general, most of the population has a sufficient intake to avoid severe malnutrition. But globally, not enough protein is definitely the most common nutritional deficiency. And this picture of this little person, so the name, it's Kawashikor. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but it's a condition caused by malnutrition. So fluid enters the abdominal cavity because there's not enough protein, so it causes that swelling in the belly. Now in affluent countries, so countries like Canada, United States, the UK, so there are still nutritional disorders that happen here, but most commonly you're going to see anorexia and bulimia. You generally don't see a protein deficiency in these countries. It's more eating disorders. So anorexia being that self-starvation even when a person's underweight. It's kind of like an intense and irrational fear of gaining weight, which causes them to severely undereat. And bulimia, which is a pattern of binging and purging. So they may appear to eat normally, but they also have behaviors like vomiting, overuse of laxatives, or exercising excessively. So obesity. So this question, depending on where you find your sources, so it's a growing concern in industrialized countries. So people are eating too much and not getting enough exercise. So there's a larger percentage of us that are overweight now. So depending on which source you look at, Stats Canada actually sets Nova Scotia at 37.5%. So D is kind of the general consensus. So even a few years ago it may have been lower than that, but the latest Stats Canada results are saying over 35% of our population is overweight. Okay, so reading labels. Honestly, there are lots of great websites that can help you if you're looking at your nutrition labels. This is one of them. Any that are from the Government of Canada are pretty good because Canada has very specific requirements for nutrition labels. So as long as it's Canadian, you should be getting good advice. So this is an example of what a label might look like for one cookie. So when you are doing your assignment, make sure, so if a serving size is one cookie, like I don't know who eats one cookie, I certainly don't, I maybe 6. So everything on this label, if I'm eating 6 cookies, I have to multiply it by 6. So keep that in mind when you're doing your assignment to make sure you're doing it for what's a serving size you would normally eat. Breakfast cereal is a big one, a big culprit there, because usually a serving size is half a cup, say, but most people will probably eat a cup and a half. So over here it has a couple of percentages here. So if you are wanting to, watch your fat intake, so your saturated fat, say, so things that you want to reduce in your diet commonly are sodium and saturated fat. You're going to want to look for options that have less than 5%. So ideally, you would like this to be less than 5%. Things that are good for you, so like fiber, protein, as examples in this one. So some nutrition facts would also have vitamins down here and minerals. So those are awesome if they're greater than 15%. So it would be good to have those as greater than 15%. That would be a fairly healthy option. for you. So your food labels assignment, if you read through that assignment and you don't understand anything, please ask in the Q&A. And that's it for now. Respiratory system, I will do a pre-recorded session for that you can review. But that is it for digestion. Are there any questions? Are you all asleep now? An hour and 11 minutes is a long time to sit and listen to a Skype presentation, I know. So I think most of you that are doing assignments and doing your mastering biology, I think you're doing a really good job. Just keep it up. And thank you too for joining me again for the Skype session. It's nice to just not talk to myself. And I hope maybe there's a little bit of sunshine where you both are at. Right now we just had a heavy downpour here in Truro where it was sunny a little bit ago, so you find multiple choice confusing. Do you read the textbook first before you do the mastering assignment? Yeah, and the tests for this course are also multiple choice, so it is good to practice multiple choice questions. But is English is English your second language? Because sometimes that does make it tricky too, I understand that. So the more you practice them, the better it will be for the test, probably. Just make sure you're reading them very carefully. Be careful for words like always and never in a question. And sometimes they're confusing when it's talking about, which one of these is not true. So just make sure you're reading them very carefully.